me, the visionary is very much an embodied experience, and that there are states of deep embodiment, such as trance, possession, mimesis, in which you would include dance and acting, in which the vision is very much enfleshed and coming from the flesh. The important thing is this: the imagination, the visionary, is in continuous movement, as much when we are awake as when we are sleeping, and that consciousness itself is completely oriented towards movement. We can't think of the visionary without thinking of bodies moving.
Hello and welcome to The Heretic. Very excited for this week's guest. She has worked as a dancer, choreographer, author, publisher, and indeed a mystic. And this week she's talking to us about the body, its discontents, and all its wonderful potential. Welcome, Alkistis. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Much of your work has a through line of Butoh, so this week's patron heretic is Tatsumi Hijikata. I wanted you to perhaps tell us a bit about his work, the genesis of Butoh, particularly in the conservative environment of post-war Japan.
Okay, Hijikata Tatsumi. Butoh kind of started with a bit of a happening in 1959 with a performance called Forbidden Colors or Forbidden Eros. It can be translated both ways. And the dance itself wasn't defined. It was sort of the beginnings of what Hijikata was trying to do to tear away from both traditional Japanese dance, but also the Western dance that had been like fashionable in Japan for some time. I think since like the 19th century, it started to come in more through trade and so on. I see Butoh very much as a product of the Second World War, in the sense that the origins of Butoh are not only Japanese, but they're also that encounter between the Japanese and different forces that flooded into the country as a result of the American victory. And so you will have dancers like Catherine Dunham and German expressionist dancers. And these kind of influences, the European avant-garde, sort of Afro-Caribbean spiritual dance, these things also came in and kind of encountered what Hijikata remembered from his childhood in northern Japan, in Tohoku, and the sort of the peasant body and the bodies that were being lost in the sort of the modernization of Japan. So there was some sort of sense to summon up these ghosts as well as these kind of figures of the other from outside Japan, and make something very, very peculiarly Japanese in many ways, but also that has, as the popularity of Butoh outside Japan shows, that has a way of speaking across any kind of linguistic or cultural boundaries.
What would you say the aim of Butoh is in this context, or if it has a name at all? Or
I don't think it's static. I think it's actually, because it's so close to its birth, it's still a form that has a lot of this energetic of the beginning in it. It has this possibility to keep transforming. It's still very young. And I think this was always the case. Butoh, it reminds me, when like kabuki started in Japan, and it was actually very rough. It happened in a riverbed, and some performers got together, like prostitutes or miko, like the shamaness. They were maybe mixed up, maybe both, maybe they were criticized by Buddhists, I don't know. But it was something that hadn't yet been solidified and fixed. And I think Butoh is still like this. Hijikata didn't leave a particular methodology. He just he kept developing them and kept pushing them and working with different people, different dancers. So the potential, well, it's very hard to say what is Butoh to recognize it. You can kind of feel it, but you can't define it. And it's still got that sense that it can keep developing and keep absorbing new ideas and to keep producing new bodies. So this is what I find fascinating about it compared to like more sort of culturally fixed dance forms.
Some of us, or many of us, have a sense that something is rotten in Denmark, and perhaps the body and the self are in a kind of crisis. Can you become the doctor and maybe diagnose here some of the problems we're looking at for the body, for the self in 2020?
I think we're coming to terms collectively and individually with many traumas that have been building within us, and a sense that we haven't been living right by our bodies or by other bodies, other people's bodies. There's a lot of insensitivity, and there has been for some time, and we're having a lot of those reckonings now, whether that's in terms of health crises or various protest movements which are fighting for, in many cases, the very existence of people with particular bodies or characteristics. So I think we have, and this is very high in the atmosphere at the moment. This is very, very present to us all. We're all feeling this. And just even the precariousness of living now, how difficult it is to even pay rent or, you know, keep a job. Everything is like very transient at the moment, very precarious. I think that because the body is the fundamental unit of our intercorporeal existence, of our intersubjective, then we have to address what is the body and what is it really, and how should it be, and how can it be, and what can we do with it, and how can we become these bodies we need to be going into the future. I think we're very much at a crisis point, and Butoh itself came out of the crisis following the Second World War and the various rationalizations of modernity. So we're having something like that again. It's almost like the development of the first crisis is reaching an even higher peak, and I think there's even more distress amongst people. I see it much more common. It's not like just one countercultural movement or the kids. I think this is happening to a lot of people, this experience. So
what are kind of the fault lines, or what are the roots of dysfunction?
The roots are I'm trying to find the roots. It's not funny, but I think there are different impediments to our being able to even address what the problem is. And I see that it's very hard to have discussions, particularly online, because the digital medium does not favor deep communication, a communication that's like effectively felt between the people talking. There's no skin in the game, as Nassim Taleb would say. And I think this is the first hurdle, because many of us have and carry a lot of pain in our bodies. And there's a lot of just general discomfort. You can tell by just how many medications people are on, like sort of, or drug abuse or whatever abuse. It's not use. I think this is like maybe the first hurdle, is just that coming to terms with the fact that our bodies aren't perfect, that our bodies are in pain, that we are weak, that we are vulnerable. This admitting of vulnerability and starting to penetrate into the deeper layers of what's at the core of that, but also the different like strata where this has been put upon us, both as individuals, but also throughout our history, our genetic history. You know, we could recapitulate that and find, you know, we have died many times. We have lived many times through many forms before we've made this form. So we have all these experiences of traumatic death, of pain, as well as joyful experiences in our body. But I think at the moment people have very much feel overwhelmed by particularly what I'm seeing discussed as kind of ancestral trauma. This seems to be something that is becoming higher in the consciousness at the moment.
Understood. So this is a nice segue into your very wonderful idea of the occulted body. This is sort of the heart of your work, would you say, right? The occulted body?
This kind of underlies like sort of the way it all goes off in other directions. It's like underneath everything is the occulted body. I called it the occulted body because I was kind of frustrated with the way, in particularly the field I work in, which is the esoteric or the occult field, and dance, that the body is seen in a very it's in the occult, it's split between you have the subtle body and you have the body, and the body's hardly spoken about, or it wasn't at all when I started like talking and working in this way. And I wanted to make it clear that what we think of as the subtle body or the energetic body is actually something that's fully connected to our physical material bodies, and that we don't even know what they are. They're something which we see the surface only, like literally. There's so much of our bodies that is permanently hidden to us. As a dancer too, because I'm always working with a kinetic and a kinesthetic medium, so much of dance is about this communication of affectivity, of feeling, of a kind of expression through movement. And this opens up the body and opens up sort of the sight in the body in a way that I haven't found other things do so well, like simple sitting meditation. I think it takes perhaps longer to get quite the same amount of heat generated. So I've just been doing this work, and the occulted body was also trying to find a way of integrating kind of scientific ideas. I was particularly influenced by the work of Dr. Mai Wan Ho on the sort of the liquid crystalline state of the body, especially the connective tissues. And I wanted, and out of this, the fact that the body is liquid, comes the electromagnetic, and this, you know, the subtle or the angelic comes out of this. So they're intimately connected all the time. They're the same thing. It's just different octaves in one thing. And so I wanted to find a way of just expressing this idea that we don't know what our bodies are or what they're capable of becoming. While, yeah, there's the mystery there. We still have a lot we don't know about it. And my work is really about continually kind of pushing into exploring that through art, the dance art, mainly, then trying to write about it, trying to put it into words.
So the body is a fantastic mystery. It's really our portal to all of our experience, all of our knowing.
All of our knowledge,
yeah, and maybe we're a little blocked, maybe we're a little backed up because of our thinking or because of our bad habits. But if we do engage it, it seems there's greater intelligence, greater vision there for those of us. You have an idea of mantic vision. Can you bring us inside how the body can achieve mantic vision and perhaps hint at the value of mantic vision?
Okay. Think about this. Again, I found in a lot of Western thinking that there is a critique of vision as being very much, you know, a Western dominant, logocentric, dominating sense. And it's often presented like this, often in feminist discourse, actually, because the idea of the gaze. But I question that because I find that the gaze works both ways, and that there is power in being looked at as well as in looking, and that many ways of looking are not as straightforward as the simple for example, that the extreme example would be the panopticon, this kind of sense of control through looking and being seen. There's a seeing which is connected to the body. There are many seeings connected to the body. So there's the seeing we're doing, looking at each other through our eyes now, but there's also the seeing when we dream. There's the seeing when we hallucinate. There's the seeing when we have visions. There are, like, as well as the seeings that you get when you start to visually experience the kinesthetic feelings that your body's generating. So all of these are connected to the body. It's not like there's a disembodied seeing called vision, but I think that the visionary is very much connected again to the visual sense. Everything is grounded in this body that we have and its potential. It's remarkable, and we don't even know what it's capable of, and still it's so limited in terms of the entire universe, the cosmos. So yeah, to explore beyond what we can see. This work was tied with a particular performance where I wanted to understand how I could perceive Venus, the planet, because Venus is this mysterious veiled planet. We can't see the surface. So if one wants to see Venus, you have to go there in vision. So there's a long tradition of methodologies of inducing visions in all over the world. There's a lot of ways one can use just simply movement or stillness or psychoactives. There are many things, or scrying, but fundamentally they all come down to this ability to perceive something further than what's just in front of us. So yeah, and I like the totem of the mantis. I find the mantis is a fascinating creature. Yeah, so I called mantic visions because this ability to see into the future as well, or back, yeah, is
So something that sort of comes to mind and to help our audience is, you know, we're taught a history of the world in which in the past, at some point, people were superstitious, bathed in ignorance, and then a light came on and everybody was rational and scientific, and there was all these developments, and now we're living in a perfectly reasonable world. But if you look back, and certainly if you're a reader of your publisher, Scarlet Imprint, you see a history between science and the mystical that is much more enmeshed and much more complex than this kind of idea that rationality occurred like a light turning on.
yeah.
Are there any particular thinkers that sort of had mantic vision and were tied to science, or the development of the modern world that you can maybe share with our audience to sort of show a practice in something surprising?
I mean, as I mentioned before, Dr. Maya Wan Ho is someone whose work I found really interesting because it's so tied to the visual in the sense of, like, she found these colors that were generated by the water of our living organisms because they have a sort of coherence which makes these beautiful rainbows. It's like another level of communication that belongs to, like, the dark senses and just the microscope. So yeah, I think there are lots of scientists that I can't even think of names, but so many scientists that have this mystical awareness. I think one of the problems in the contemporary occult is that historically the occult was the cutting edge of science too. It was like the occult philosophy was ways of knowing what we couldn't understand or see in the world, in nature. And it's abandoned some of those, like, ideas of being interested. So for example, in the early modern period, the recent books that I've been working on were both by, like, either late medieval or early modern magicians. Optics was really cutting edge technology. So the way to see into the spirit world, into the angelic world, was through a looking glass, through a crystal. And there was this sense that you would actually see into those worlds because that's what these devices do. And that doesn't really happen in the occult anymore. But I also think that the first way of knowing is, like, through the body. Everything we know is through this carnal knowledge, through the corporeal knowledge. So before we even can interpret what it is that we see as scientists, we have to still be in touch with our body and recognize our interconnectedness with everything. And I think that's where science is at in its like most progressive exponents. It's just that there's also money involved, and where money is involved in science, and there are certain ends, and there's a dominant ideology, ours is capitalism at the moment. You don't necessarily get good science either, but we have already all the tools in, like, you know, the rational sciences to be completely rational about this. But that rationality would mean that we would have to accept that there's nothing separating us from any other living thing, but we are no more important than any other living thing, that we have a responsibility because we're sharing this livingness, but then we have the responsibility to ourselves as well to become something, to take this energy that we're born with, this seed that we have when we come into life, and take it as far as it will go in the conditions that we're given.
Okay, good. This is I like this is wonderful, because we're talking about sort of the ethos of science at its best, the ethos of mysticism at its best. It's a desire to go out and truly know the universe. And again, we're talking about a blockage, and the blockage that's maybe historical, maybe accumulated. There's a mytheme in sort of horror films and everything that we're all familiar with, called the witch's sabbat. And the shadow of this theme is perhaps a hidden history of religions, a hidden history of suppression, a hidden history of many things. But I think the one thing we know about the witch's sabbat is it occurs out in the wilderness, out on the heath in the mountains, near a river or a place of power. And we know it's about connecting to something that we shouldn't be connecting to, perhaps, or that we've forgotten how to connect to. You've written extensively about the witch's sabbat, and there's a lot we could talk about in there. But I think the most interesting part, as it relates to your practice, is the hidden history of how the witch's sabbat is actually a story about the church sanctioning dance. Can you talk a little bit about the dance culture and how it was repressed by the church?
I think this is complicated because in the entire history of the church, there are a lot of examples of Christians dancing, and Jesus was even described in the Gospels as dancing with his apostles, with his companions, and that was a ring dance too, with Jesus in the center and the companions. So very, very, very close to the sort of the cliche of the witch's sabbat, the image of the witches and the devils dancing around the devil. But generally, and this is something which you see as states begin to be more consolidated in the sense of, you know, these territories belong to these, and the sort of control. So like the early modern period, and with the arrival of political thinkers like Jean Baudin, I think you see the beginnings of a biopolitics that wants to control people's bodies and to channel that energy into, you know, worthy labor and child making and all the sort of the good things that people should be doing, and steer them away from like drinking wine and whoring and sleeping with the wrong people. You know, so there's that. It's interesting too, because there's a lot of dancing all throughout the history of Europe, and all while the idea of the witches' dance is being condemned in print or in iconography, you also have like court dances and other dances which are the right dances and which have this sort of etiquette of movement and the controlled body and the right way to do things. And the witches are very much placed in opposition to that. They are like shown to be the sort of the antithesis of that. So you have this antagonism. The king needs the witches in order for him to put them down and express like his right to rule and the correct way of doing things. And I think that the looking at the witches dance is a very interesting thing, because you get immediately, so the witches are everything that we're not supposed to be, that we're not supposed to explore in our bodies, but yet exists. And I wanted to go into those places with my body too. Through Butoh, I was able to start to look more at the unconscious movements, like the things that just come out, like when you're falling asleep and you shudder, or when you are being in crisis and you have your body just breaks. These kind of feelings where movement comes out that has not been cultured yet. And those movements are very interesting to me too, not just the sort of the bawdiness and the energy that is spent with this thing, but just those small ways that the body speaks through movement, which isn't already beneath the logos, let's say, that has the rule already, imposed on it.
So there have always been rules for the body. The state and the dominant ideology always want the body to behave a particular way, and whether that's, a Roman state being unhappy with Dionysian cults, or even putting people with Tourette's syndrome or twitches into an institution.
Yeah.
Something else in your work on the Witches' Sabbat is you talked about sort of the contradiction of Elizabeth I. And this is the moment of sort of the British Empire really starting to project its power out into the universe.
This was the very beginning of that, yeah.
Yeah. And she was renowned for her dance of La Volta. Can you just talk a little bit about her as a character and perhaps her environment and the folks around her and that moment?
Yeah, she's a fascinating figure, isn't she? I mean, she obsessed me as soon as I discovered her when I came to England. And, well, it's not actually said that she danced La Volta even, or that it was her favorite, but this was said about her. There's no evidence for this, but these were the kind of rumors that were spread. And I think that it's quite possible that she did this because it was fashionable, and England was a really rocking place back then. People were singing, they were dancing all the time, they were passionate. I don't know what happened to England. I think something happened with the Victorian period. But anyway, at this time, England was really different energetically. The beginnings of the British Empire and this expansion of, well, it was through D. I need to get this straight. Elizabeth as the Queen wasn't supposed, she was wrong. She was compared to the Whore of Babylon, for example, because she was the harlot on the English throne. She turned away from Rome. So she was the enemy, and there was a sense that she had to be morally wrong as well. So the things said about her dancing are partly in order to discredit her virtue as a person, as a king, as a queen. But I found it interesting that in this figure you have someone who is both the king but also the witch, and has both those powers, both the power of logos and statecraft, but also language, but also the power of the body and that ability to erotically transfix her audience, to magnetically transfix them as well. And then that power has to have partly been behind the way that her sailors went across the ocean and conquered lands and brought back treasures, and they were throwing their capes in front of her. There's an erotic aliveness to Elizabeth, so I can completely believe that her dancing was incredible. Yeah, the interesting thing as well, I've been reading recently a poem called the Purple Isle, which was also sort of a post-Spencer poem, so very influenced by Spencer's Fairy Queen. And this is completely looking at the body and seeing the body as this virgin territory waiting to be conquered, but it's also a poem of devotion to the body. So there's that antagonism there as well. You have something which is very beautiful and completely dedicated to the strange land of the body, but it's also this land that's like a virgin waiting to be conquered. And so you have, I don't know, it's a very strident period. It's very much a period of going out and just conquering and not thinking about consequences so much. Yeah, there's a lot more work to do there.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're getting closer to the end of the program. I wanted to bring it back to some of your current work, female mysteries and sexuality through the nymph. As you may know, I'm a big fan of the nymph, the yogini, the maenad.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you're doing a projected cycle of dances called Apocalyptaria. Can you just tell us a little bit about this and the exploration?
Okay, the Apocalyptaria. Because I'm fascinated by the figure of the harlot of Babylon, also known as Babylon, the sort of modern goddess that sort of come into being in the 20th century very, very forcefully, let's say, but has much, much more history than that. And I was questioning, what is this apocalypse? What does this apocalypse mean? What is her connection to apocalypse? And it's again what I was saying earlier about the veiling of Venus being veiled in clouds that we can't see beyond. And the apocalypse is an unveiling, a revelation. But I'm very interested in the symbolism of the veil as well. I was briefly practicing a practicing Muslim, and I wore the veil, and it was a very powerful thing to do, and a very, very, very potent form of body work, actually. And so I knew that the idea, like the Western idea that veiled people are downtrodden and victims, is a completely simplistic, and it's a very multivalent symbol and a piece of clothing, and with a very, very, very long history. So I started looking into this and wanting to ask questions, but seeing how much it is connected with the idea of womanhood or female sexuality, the nymph which is also like a female elemental or goddess figure, like a yogini, but it's the same word also was used for the female clitoris, for the clitoris. So I wanted to find what were all the connections between these things and try to take my veils away, like going through the occulted body and my own history, recapitulate my personal history, in order to find what is my sexuality, how did it come to be, why am I like this now, like who am I, where am I going? So looking at figures, the first dance was the decollation of flowers, and it was looking a revisioning of the dance of Salome from a perspective quite different than the sort of salacious way it's usually presented. And looking at that relationship between the mother and the daughter particularly, and this imprinting of the erotic nature on the child through touch, particularly with the mother, and this like intense experience. Visitation is another part of that. Again, the unveiling was this, try to find a way through the dance to have that vision of Venus through particular like movements. And the one I'm working on now is pater, which is looking at that relationship particularly with the father, or the archetype of the father, and how one becomes through the particular atmosphere or environment that the father has given you, that you arise into. Yeah, so this is sort of, it's a big way, it's a big thing to explore, but each dance is playing with this image and exploring these images and ideas in particular ways.
Great, thank you. So to end the show, we like to kind of have you leave us with some other artists or writers or thinkers that are perhaps breadcrumbs for us to start other journeys. Is there anything recent you've been looking at or are interested in, or might give to our audience to kind of go on a fairy path with?
I'm assuming your audience will already know Antoninato, who kind of started me off on this path at too young an age. So I would recommend, as a very interesting thinker, thinking about the body and crisis, and the ability of theatre particularly to change, to transform, to heal. There's so many writers.
It's a hideous question, I know.
I know. You should have given me a warning. You know who I'm really loving at the moment, but I'm really wrestling with it? It's a French philosopher called Michel Henry, who has a wonderful book called Incarnation, which is a philosophy of the flesh. So he's a phenomenologist, but he really turns phenomenology inside out, and he's also very, very spiritual. So he's often perceived as like a sort of part of the theological turn of French philosophy, but it's so deep and so interesting in the questions he asks, and what the flesh is, and that it is something that we are, the connection of the flesh to life with a capital L. And his writing as well, like on barbarism and art, are really interesting. Barbarism is his critique of our current civilization, if that's the right word for it. And his writings on art, on the invisible in art, like Kandinsky, they're really fascinating too. So I like his work a lot, and I'm having interesting debates in my head with him when I'm reading it. So yeah.
Thank you for coming on The Heretic. You're definitely a heretic par exemplar, and we look forward to more of your work, more of the work.